This video will cover just about every controversial aspect to this that I have seen, and I really work to understand the critiques. I don't want to strawman their position. I even give, don't be triggered, the best evidence for those that want to have a genetic-based racism. Because let's be honest, you can't ignore the racist elephant in the room. In my own comment sections and on just about every other video I've seen on this topic, people are putting all sorts of theories in the comment section, and they get a ton of traction. So we might as well address it. And please, if you are in that group, or even just someone who's unsure of the arguments against it, please stick around. Because these people often post things that have internal logic, but they really do just fall apart when you include all the data. Their argument might not be lying per se in the particular, but their conclusion is ignoring all this other evidence, so let's get into it. Starting at the very beginning. All life on Earth started billions of years ago with very simple, single-celled organisms. From these ancient beginnings, life slowly diversified and evolved into increasing complexity, first microbes, then simple plants and fungi, followed by multicellular creatures like insects, fish, mammals, and eventually humans. Because we all originated from the same early ancestors, every living thing shares at least some DNA with each other, even if only the most basic instructions for life. As we move up this evolutionary ladder from simpler organisms like bacteria, which have around a 7 to 10% DNA similarity with humans, to yeast and fungi at roughly 26 to 50%, to plants like bananas that you might have seen at 60%, there's this progression with increasing genetic overlap. Animals bring us even closer. Insects like fruit flies still share about 60% of our DNA, while mammals like mice and cows share about 80 to 85%. Dogs, cats, and other common pets are even closer at about 90% genetic similarity to humans. Finally, our nearest evolutionary relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, share an astonishing 98 to 99% of our DNA. This close genetic relationship shows how recently we branched off from them, just a few million years ago. But what exactly is DNA? Well, DNA is a long molecule shaped like a twisting ladder. Everyone's seen the famous double helix. And the rungs of this ladder are made of 4 chemical bases, A, T, C, G, and their sequence encodes biological information. Every time a cell divides, this code is copied and passed on, and this is how traits are inherited from parent to offspring. Because all organisms use DNA in fundamentally the same way, it reveals our common heritage, because those genes were present in a distant ancestor and have been conserved across evolutionary time. Biologically, all life is using that language of DNA, and when we compare DNA across species, we see clear patterns of family resemblance. Genetic comparisons have allowed scientists to reconstruct the grand family tree of life, confirming that all organisms are related. And by seeing this context, we can estimate roughly when lines of descent split. Like genetic data indicate that common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees lived around 6 to 7 million years ago. Humans didn't evolve from chimps, we both evolved out from some original ancestor, and are still being slowly changed by our environment and just random mutations. We're still evolving today. This fundamental genetic unity also means that differences between species, or between individuals, come down to relatively small changes in DNA. Among humans, the DNA of any 2 people is 99.9% identical. This is what makes us all Homo sapien and forms a common thread across the world, while that tiny 0.1% difference contributes to our individual uniqueness. We are almost 100% alike, though life is so complex and interesting that just that 0.1% makes all the difference. Appreciating this fact is key to understanding our evolutionary story. We'll get to out of Africa in a second, but you can see it all as out of this original DNA ancestor, and then our Homo sapien species being out of Africa. But it's all on a continuum with millions and billions of years. Because DNA is universal across all living things, scientists are confident that life on Earth started only once, or at least only one survived. We'll see a parallel to this in early immigrations out of Africa. But just focusing here on DNA, if multiple separate origins had occurred, it would be an incredible coincidence for all of us to have such a similar DNA-based code. Instead, everything from the simplest microbe to the largest animal inherited the same basic genetic system from a single source in the ancient past. Biochemist Douglas Theobald conducted a large-scale genetic analysis to test this idea of a single common origin, and he found that the evidence, quote, overwhelmingly supports universal common ancestry, showing it is millions of times more probable than the idea that life arose multiple times independently and yet still uses that same base DNA code. So keep all that in mind, as it's a similar argument against the idea that modern Homo sapiens could have emerged in different areas, basically that hominids were all over the earth, they formed into hominins, and what we call races or people groups, from the Yoruba to Han Chinese, were all the result of local evolutionary mutations, i.e. some hominids became Yoruba in Africa, and other hominids became Chinese. That might sound plausible at first, and there were major scholars and universities that held these positions, but we'll see why decades of better evidence is against this. And so it is not believed that there were multiple independent evolutions moving from inorganic to that first organic life. But even if early life was a bit messy, with primitive cells swapping genes, it seems that ultimately one lineage won out and became the ancestor of all present-day life. As Theobald explains, even if there were multiple initial origins, maybe that spark of life happened in 5 different spots, 5 different times that inorganic material had that transition into the first organic matter, what we see across all of Earth today is the result of either the one that survived, or they merged through gene exchange. Either way, all of life would still be genetically related, and we all come out of that one being that emerged. Again, this relates to some of the Homo sapien migrations that made it out of Africa first. Or even if you want to posit that something close evolved independently in Europe or Asia, it is irrelevant to the point of genetic ancestry of all modern humans around the world today, as those other lines, even if they did exist, all died out and did not contribute to our genome in any significant way. In other words, even if you saw that things that looked a lot like humans did emerge independently on all the different continents, those are not your ancestors. Even if they were raptured by the Anunnaki, that would be a separate point from this entire debate. They have no effect on our genetic ancestry. And on the largest scale, this concept is incredibly profound. I don't see this as some cynical view of the universe, as some cold clinical examination, or that there's nothing wonderful or mysterious going on with existence. There's that famous quote by Alan Watts.
Somebody came from another galaxy in a flying saucer and had a look at the solar system, and they looked it over and shrugged their shoulders and said, just a bunch of rocks. And they went away. Later they came around and they looked at it again. And they said, excuse me, we thought it was a bunch of rocks, but it's peopling. And it's alive. After all, it has done something intelligent. Because you see, we grow out of this world in exactly the same way that the apples grow on the apple tree. If evolution means anything, it means that. Where there are rocks, watch out. Watch out. Because the rocks are going eventually to come alive.
If all life is related, then clearly humans too evolved from earlier life forms. We weren't poofed into existence separately. We branched off the tree of life like every other creature. So who are our closest relatives, and how did we come to be distinct? Within the animal kingdom, humans are primates, the group that includes monkeys and apes, and our closest living relatives are the African great apes, particularly chimpanzees and bonobos, sharing about 98 to 99% of our DNA. Fossils and DNA evidence together tell us that the human lineage split from the lineage leading to chimps around 6 to 7 million years ago, somewhere in Africa. At that time, our ancestors were not human as we think of it. They were what's called hominids, a broad term for great apes, including those early human-like creatures. Over the next few million years, these ancestors developed more human-like traits and became what scientists call hominids. So what's the difference between a hominid and a hominin? In simple terms, hominids refers to all those apes, including humans, chimps, gorillas, orangutans, and their ancestors, where hominins refers specifically to the human branch after the split from the apes. You'll see people throw around that it's so dumb to think that we're just apes, and I'm like, well, you can make it sound even dumber by saying scientists think we're all bacteria. Let's go even further back, we're just energy plus time. Hominins are our direct ancestors and closest extinct relatives, species that are more closely related to us than to chimpanzees. They are distinguished by a suite of traits that mark the path to humanity. They evolved an erect posture, and the fancy term habitual bipedalism, which means that they walked on two legs. This bipedal locomotion freed the hands and set the stage for other changes. And hominids also show larger brains, and evidence of behaviors unlike those of other apes, like making sophisticated stone tools and eventually using language. In short, it's upright walking, a bigger brain, and I think most importantly, the advanced cognition and behavior traits that are the hallmarks of the hominid lineage. Paleoanthropologists have unearthed fossils of numerous hominin species that lived over the past 7 million years. Early examples include Sahelanthropus, around 7 million years old, and Ardipithecus, about 5 to 6 million years old, which had some ape-like features but also hints of bipedalism. Later came the Australopithecines, like the famous Australopithecus afarensis, or Lucy, from about 3.2 million years ago, who definitely walked upright but still had a small brain. No offense, Luce. From one of these Australopithecine species, or a closely related form, the genus Homo arose roughly 2.5 million years ago, and all Homo are considered human. Early Homo species, like Homo habilis, had larger brains and made stone tools, earning the nickname handyman. And by around 2 million years ago, Homo erectus appeared, a truly significant ancestor that had a more human-like body proportion and a much larger brain. Homo erectus was also the first hominin known to migrate out of Africa and into other continents. We'll come back to that more in a bit, but erectus was the focus of the video on the first seafarers, as we can deduce that they must have made simple floating craft, as their fossils appear in places that have been islands for millions of years. Over time, other species evolved from these early humans, including the stocky Neanderthals in Europe and Asia, and the mysterious Denisovans in Asia, and of course us, Homo sapiens, in Africa. One of the most recent breakthroughs is that these different human species were not totally isolated. Many of them mated. In the common sense, we tend to think of species as completely separate, but in human evolution, the lines are blurred at times because we are not as divergent from each other. Even that 1% difference between us and chimps means we can't reproduce with chimps. Please believe me on that. But even as diverse as these other hominins seem, they're still less than 1% different from us. And so while that species designation is useful, it's not as clear-cut a delineation as it's often used for other animals. If that sounds silly, it's actually for the same reason that those other hominins don't exist. Many of the intermediate beings that existed between two species that can't interbreed today have died off. If you went back in time, all those intermediate beings, of course, could have interbred. It's just now they've become so separate that they can't. Just like us and chimps having that shared ancestor millions of years ago. It's not that if we went in a time machine 6 million years ago, a human and a chimp could interbreed. It's that distinction of human and chimp might not have been so differentiated to deserve the term species. And so because all hominins are so close, when modern Homo sapiens left Africa, they encountered Neanderthals and interbred. About 1 to 2% of the DNA in people of European or Asian ancestry comes from Neanderthals. This isn't measuring fossils, but it's the most objective evidence we have of this genetic mixing. A 2022 study led by Joshua Aki at Princeton University utilized a novel computation method called IBD mix to detect Neanderthal ancestry in African populations as well. This research revealed that Africans possess about 17 megabases of Neanderthal DNA, equating to about 0.3% of their genome. This finding was unexpected, as the earlier consensus was that Neanderthal DNA was virtually absent in African genomes. The presence of Neanderthal DNA in African populations is attributed to so-called back migrations. After modern humans interbred with Neanderthals outside Africa, some of these admixed populations migrated back into Africa, introducing Neanderthal genetic material into African gene pools. Similarly, Melanesians, like the people of Papua New Guinea, and some Aboriginal Australians carry up to 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA, the highest known levels of Denisovan ancestry in any human group today. Contrast that with East Asians, South Asians, and some Native American groups that have much smaller amounts, generally around 0.1 to 0.5% Denisovan ancestry, likely due to more ancient and less direct gene flow events. And so while all these findings were first clearly articulated in a 2014 Nature study, they have consistently been reconfirmed by multiple high-resolution genome sequencing projects. The presence of Denisovan DNA in these populations indicates that modern humans must have encountered Denisovans somewhere in the Wallacea region, the islands between mainland Southeast Asia and Australia, and this encounter likely occurred after Homo sapiens crossed into this region around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, during the migration towards Sahul, which is the name for the combined Ice Age landmass of Australia and New Guinea. Studies like those of Jacobs et al. In 2019 suggest that there may have been multiple interbreeding events with different Denisovan populations. It wasn't just a one-time thing. For example, New Guineans and Aboriginal Australians may carry DNA from a distinct Southeast Asian Denisovan lineage, different from the one that contributed small amounts of DNA to East Asians. And there's also the relatively new find of so-called ghost or archaic introgressed DNA in African populations. It's one of the most fascinating and active areas of research in human evolutionary genetics. This term refers to segments of DNA in modern humans that appear to come from unknown or extinct hominin populations, whose fossil remains and genomes have not yet been found or sequenced. Unlike Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry, which is relatively well understood due to the sequencing of those ancient genomes. It was actually by doing DNA tests on Denisovans that researchers confirmed that this was a different species. The ghost DNA in Africa reveals an even deeper, more mysterious evolutionary story, which is embedded in the genetic code of sub-Saharan Africans only. The most recent studies estimate that some sub-Saharan African populations may carry between 2% and as much as 19% of DNA from one or more of these unknown archaic hominids. These figures do not refer to overall archaic ancestry in the sense of Neanderthal admixture in Europeans and Asians, but to segments of the genome that are unusually divergent, too old and distinct to have originated from any known Homo sapien lineage. These genetic signals point to admixture events between early Homo sapiens and deeply divergent hominin groups that likely existed exclusively in Africa and which are now extinct. One of the most important studies in this area was published in Science Advances in 2020. Using a method called ARG-Weaver-D, the researchers examined genomes from African populations like the Yoruba in West Africa and Mendi in Sierra Leone, and found evidence of introgression from an unknown archaic population that, according to their models, this ghost population likely split from the lineage leading to Homo sapiens over 500,000 to 1 million years ago, possibly even earlier than the split between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. The researchers estimate that up to 19% of the Yoruba genome may show signs of this archaic admixture, indicating a substantial and previously unrecognized contribution to modern African genetic diversity. This discovery builds on earlier work by Hammer et al. In 2011, who also found evidence of archaic genetic contributions in the genome of the Yoruba, suggesting admixture events between Homo sapiens and unknown hominids around 35 to 130,000 years ago. A separate study by Lachance et al. In 2012 examined Central African hunter-gatherers, including the Biaka and Baka peoples, who are commonly referred to as pygmy populations, and found that some of their genetic variations diverged from the Homo sapiens lineage more than 700,000 years ago. These segments couldn't be explained by standard models of human population history, and were interpreted as traces of interbreeding with a deeply divergent, now extinct hominin population. The best guess on who these mysterious ancestors were, and it should be stressed that it's fair to critique that as just a guess, but the candidate is Homo heidelbergensis, often regarded as the common ancestor of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens. Some researchers suggest that isolated African populations of heidelbergensis or a related species may have survived long enough to interbreed with early Homo sapiens, though these ghost populations might belong to an entirely unknown species that existed in ecological niches across the African continent. It's a big place that's hard to excavate, and so of course newer finds could add details to this, but none of this shakes up the core principles of this evolutionary theory. It does go to the point of my video about how Jebel Uhrud destroyed the idea of the African Eden, which a lot of people projected what they wanted onto that title, but it was getting at a very niche point. That finds were destroying the misconception that the Mitochondrial Eve idea doesn't mean that all Homo sapien species were forged in one relatively small area. A lot of people assumed I was attacking the idea of Mitochondrial Eve, and maybe I should have stressed that aspect more, but I've noticed that a lot of people have this misconception that Homo sapien evolution was something like kangaroos, as if this East African Eden was an island for millions of years, as if millions of years of development was just environmental pressures and mutations within our species of Homo sapiens alone, like how kangaroos evolved exclusively on Australia. A lot of people have a similar view of humans in their head when it came to East Africa, and that idea has been destroyed by ever-increasing evidence of this constant wave of interactions, going out, mixing, and coming back again over millions of years, at least 300,000 years where we draw the Homo sapien line. And don't worry, in this video I'll completely break down the Mitochondrial Eve and Y-Adam connections, and why that still does bind every human on Earth, from the sub-Saharan with the ghost DNA, to the Melanesian with Denisovan, and Scandinavian with Neanderthal admixture. All of them share relatives with these two individuals and are still 99.9% genetically identical. But it's important to remember the story up until that point. There were Homo sapiens before Mitochondrial Eve and Y-Adam, who were themselves formed by this constant intermixing with other hominids. Now, to the sub-Saharan ghost DNA part, people are justifiably confused by this. How does it not mean that you are saying that a sub-Saharan is 19% different from all other Homo sapiens? How can you give that number and say that we are 99.9% the same? The confusion here is that in effect, it is only saying that of that 0.01% divergence across different people on Earth, that tiny difference is explained by different admixtures and other factors. So someone with the highest level of archaic admixture, that would be 19% of that 0.01%. So 0.019% of their total genome, or about 1 in 5,263 DNA letters, would be due to this ghost archaic admixture. It's the case of researchers being too in their own bubble, and science communicators not breaking this down enough. They're taking for granted that you understand that 99.9% of your DNA is all the same, so we're only talking about that 0.01 difference, and all of our human variation comes from that. So isn't it interesting that of what makes you unique from others, 2% of that comes from Neanderthal or Denisovan or whatever? But also, to be fair, it is accurate to point out that you share up to 99% of your total genome with chimps. So in the context of this whole conversation, the point was always that these relatively tiny percentages result in significant variations in expression. So it would be a lie to say that sub-Saharans are 19% mixed with non-Homo sapiens, implying non-humans. But think back to that point on the shared DNA, and you realize how absurd that is, because mice would be closer to us at 85% the same. To get down to around 80%, we're looking at chickens, frogs, and zebrafish. So the racist point trying to be implied here is just absurd. But not to strawman them, it is a lie to ignore that this cuts both ways, because it is those same scientists that are saying it's only 1% variation that separates us from chimps. So now you have to argue why that 0.019% is not enough of a difference to be meaningful, and I'll get to that in a bit. And so these more recent studies do challenge the long-standing idea that archaic introgression is a phenomenon only relevant outside of Africa. It's actually that African genomes appear to hold an even deeper and more complex history of admixture, one that we're only just beginning to uncover. And the key implication here is that the concept of species boundaries when we're talking about such recently divergent organisms becomes increasingly blurry. If Homo sapiens could successfully interbreed with populations that diverged hundreds of thousands of years earlier, then we know that those lines separating species in our evolutionary tree are more for categorization and not as exclusive lines as this might imply. This interbreeding tells us that the boundaries between some hominin species were fuzzy. Though Homo sapiens is considered distinct from Neanderthals or Denisovans, they had diverged relatively recently in the hominin tree, and so were close enough genetically to produce fertile children together. But if this is true, why can't we think of modern races as essentially the same as this species difference, in that there are obvious differences, but we can still interbreed? Don't worry, we'll get to that too. But for now, focus on the fact that these three latest branches, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, were both distinct enough to tell the difference by looking at skeletons and sequencing their DNA, but still close enough to be part of a single extended human family. So by around 300,000 years ago, the world was home to multiple kinds of humans, or hominins. Early Homo sapiens in Africa, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, maybe still some Homo erectus living in Indonesia, Homo floresiensis, or the hobbits on Flores Island, and Homo naledi in South Africa. You can think of it as many different streams, but they all either dry up or overflowed by and become part of our branch, our stream that became the river of Homo sapiens that flowed out across the entire world. And the most recent genomic studies support this. A 2023 study of African genomes concluded that our ancestors descended from at least 2 distinct populations within Africa that separated for hundreds of thousands of years and later mixed. Even with that complex picture, all lines of evidence still agree that Africa is where Homo sapiens began, and even where all other hominids and hominins began. No matter how you slice it, all humans alive today have African ancestors. By far the oldest human remains around 150 to 200,000 years ago, where we are sure that they are anatomically modern humans, in sites like Homo in Ethiopia, and Herto, also in Ethiopia. They are found alongside Middle Stone Age tools, evidence that they hunted and gathered and had rich cultures, though tangible evidence of culture like art and symbolism only becomes clearer around 100,000 years ago. But perhaps the most interesting and often confusing aspect that emerged from genetics is that of the mitochondrial Eve. It refers to the most recent common matrilineal ancestor of all living humans. In other words, if you trace your mother's line back through time and do the same for every person alive, those lineages will converge on one woman. We call that woman Mitochondrial Eve. She is not the first woman or the only woman alive at her time. It's just specifically that her maternal lineage did not die out. Mitochondrial DNA is passed on from the mother, and there is this unbroken chain from mother to child that traces back all the way to her. As anthropologist Chris Stringer recounts, she is just one of many women of her time, but her descendants, through daughters, are the only ones that reach to present day. Other women's lineages either had only sons at some point, or they had kids that just didn't reproduce. People get hung up on the Eve part, but of course there were thousands of people alive at the time. It's making just the very specific point that every person on Earth today can call this African woman from about 200,000 years ago their great times 8,000 grandmother. This might sound hard to believe at first, it's not very intuitive, but to break it down, scientists think that around 200,000 years ago, the total population of Homo sapiens was only around 10,000 to 30,000 people. Most estimates actually keep close to 10,000, based on genetic evidence and modeling of ancient population sizes. So there's probably at least around 5,000 other women alive at the time of this Eve, but in various ways, everyone else's maternal lines eventually ended. It only takes one woman to not have a daughter herself to break this chain. Each woman might have had multiple children, and across thousands of generations, many family lines fade away. Let's say a woman has only sons. Those sons mate with some woman, and they both had their own unique mitochondrial DNA, but their offspring, her grandkids, only carry the son's wife's mitochondrial DNA, ending that grandmother's lineage, and then the same thing could happen the next generation. You throw in that some daughters never had children, there's a ton of different ways that a woman's individual mitochondrial DNA line comes to an end. If you can't really conceptualize how everyone on Earth is related to one woman, here's some math to help better understand this. Generation 1, Eve, has 3 daughters. Each of her daughters also has 3 daughters. Now there's 9 granddaughters. By generation 3, we're at 27. It only takes 10 generations to get to 59,049 maternal descendants. By generation 20, Eve's maternal descendants would number over 3 billion. Across thousands of generations, every other woman's maternal lineage eventually died out, and despite all odds, Eve's continued uninterrupted, eventually spreading across the entire human population. All living humans today, over 8 billion people, can trace their mitochondrial DNA directly back to this single woman through an unbroken chain of mothers. Geneticists have done similar studies on the Y chromosome, which is passed from father to son, and found what's called a Y chromosomal atom, also believed to be African around 200 to 300,000 years ago. And we should keep in mind why this is important, neither exaggerating nor minimizing it. You can't get around the fact that the totality of all evidence shows all hominins, all humans, came out of Africa, even down to tracing these connections to 2 individuals. But assuming around 25 years to a generation, Eve was 7,000 generations ago, and Adam was 8,500 generations ago. So their effect on your genome today is almost nothing. It's only important to the very specific point that we all come out of Africa. Because how else would you explain that a Native American also has this? Mitochondrial DNA is tiny, containing just a small set of genes outside the cell nucleus, and the Y chromosome makes up only about 1.5% of a man's DNA. So nearly 100% of our genomes today are shaped far more by thousands of ancestors who lived in much more recent generations. The further back you go, the smaller each ancestor's genetic contribution becomes, and after just a few dozen generations, their individual influence shrinks to almost nothing. In other words, Adam and Eve are fascinating scientifically as markers of ancient lineage and migration patterns, but genetically speaking, their direct contributions are essentially negligible compared to our more recent ancestors. If you never heard this, there was a funny proof of how prevalent first cousin marriage was and just straight up inbreeding, because if you do the straight math, and going back only 1,000 years, every person should have 1.1 trillion ancestors, because that's 2 ancestors every 25 years, and 40 generations, so 2 to the 40th, but 1.1 trillion is more people than have ever existed. Most geneticists think you have about 1 million ancestors going 1,000 years back, and so like the breakdown for how you get to generation 20 having 3 billion people connected to Eve, those are all distant cousins. They would have no sense that they were part of the same family. Obviously later they're not even the same people group. Now interestingly, researchers have even tried to pinpoint where in Africa our deepest maternal lineage might have begun. A 2019 study analyzing a particularly ancient mitochondrial DNA lineage, haplogroup L0, suggested a potential homeland in southern Africa, somewhere in Botswana, where Eve's early descendants may have lived. Though this is heavily debated even among scientists, what is agreed on is that Africa as a whole was our homeland, with populations in different regions contributing pieces to our ancestry, and that all ancestry originates from the mother continent around 200,000 years ago. By 130,000 years ago, Homo sapien groups were still in Africa, but some were on the move internally. Climate fluctuations created greener corridors in the Sahara and elsewhere, allowing populations to expand to new areas of the continent. But sometime around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, a small subset of Homo sapiens ventured out of Africa and began spreading across the globe. This event, the out-of-Africa migration, is the central saga in recent human evolution, as it led to the peopling of all continents. But it wasn't necessarily a single trek or instantaneous wave. Not just one tribe taking over the world, and importantly, this is 130,000 years after that Eve ancestor. And importantly, this could be up to 130,000 years after Eve. And it's estimated that there were around 2 million Homo sapiens alive at this time. And they may have had a skin color that ranged from dark to about the hue of the San or Nkosai people. They lived in hunter-gatherer bands. To the north, the Sahara sometimes acted as a green passage and allowed for easier travel. Other times it was far harsher, and humans may have worked their way up from Africa into the Middle East by following the Nile or moving up the coastlines. Genetic evidence shows that all non-African people today descend from this population that left Africa around this time, but that doesn't mean that there were not earlier excursions. Fossils in Israel, the Skull and Khafsa caves show Homo sapiens in the Levant around 120,000 years ago. Then, near this same area, a jawbone was found in Misleading cave, dating back to 177,000 to 194,000 years. There's even a skull from Greece in Apodima, dated to 210,000 years ago, that has been argued to be Homo sapien. But those early forays seem to have not contributed much, if anything, to the modern populations. They may have been dead-end settlements that either went extinct or eventually retreated back into Africa. The successful migration, the one that led to all present-day non-Africans, appears to have occurred around 60 to 70,000 years ago. Why, of at least 200,000 years of Homo sapiens, did they venture out at this time specifically? One answer is that at that time, climate changes might have created favorable windows. Perhaps a wetter phase greened the Arabian Peninsula or reduced the Sahara's grip on the continent. It's also possible that a breakthrough in behavior or technology, like better tools or use of boats, or even advances in social organization, allowed for a group of humans to push into new territories. Some scientists theorize a smaller human population survived a harsh climate event around 74,000 years ago, the Toba volcanic supereruption, and then they decided to look for greener pastures, carrying a new toolkit or social structure that enabled migration. While the exact trigger remains debated, the genetic data clearly shows a founder effect. All non-Africans have less genetic diversity than Africans, consistent with having arisen from a subset of the African population. Africans are more genetically diverse than the rest of the world combined, which is exactly what we'd expect if humanity started in Africa and only a branch migrated out. Even phenotypically, or how they look, people often point to the fact that the San Kosai people, having this lighter intermediate skin tone, they can be tall, have eyes that are usually associated with Asians, a common source of all these different traits that could have been diversified in different areas. And it fits with the theory that the further away from Africa you go, the less genetically diverse the populations are. In population genetics, this is known as the serial founder effect. Each migration carries only a subset of the genetic variation of that source population. Two random Africans are likely to be more genetically different from each other than a European and Asian are from each other, because the African lineage is older and more varied, closer to that source, whereas Europeans and Asians stem from a single offshoot. We have a shared source that was a subset of that group, and so Europeans and Asians are more alike than Africans from different parts of Africa. From the Middle East, humans spread out in multiple directions. One group moved east through South Asia, reaching as far as Australia by 50,000 years ago, which, when you really think about it, is astonishingly fast. Another headed north and west into Europe, arriving by roughly 45 to 40,000 years ago, where they encountered Neanderthals. Others went east into East Asia and down into Southeast Asia, and by 30,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had effectively occupied every landmass of the Old World, from Europe to East Asia and Australia. Then, around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, during the Ice Age, some of these Asians crossed the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, eventually populating North and South America. By about 12,000 years ago, humans had truly become a global species, found on 6 continents and adapted to the incredible range of environments from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests. And I am increasingly convinced of a seemingly surprising way we can date these migrations into America, which actually comes via the swastika, which if we just look at the migrating people groups, what do you know? We don't see the swastika in Africa or Australia, but it is throughout Eurasia and flows right with the ancient North Siberians, or ANS, and ancient North Eurasians, or ANE. In the Tarim Basin video, we saw how far culture could spread even without genetic mixing. So I think it's a lot more straightforward to say that these Native American groups retained this symbol that pops up around 20,000 years ago, around this Eastern Europe, North Central Asian area, and it flows with these people over into the Americas. I bring this up because even a symbol like this kind of proves the conventional timeline. It would be odd to say that the swastika was 50 to 100,000 years old, and that somehow we don't see it in Africa or Australian art. People are often surprised to see the symbol in Native American art. It seems so far off and disconnected from the Indo-European people, with the most famous example coming from India. Well, not the most recent famous example, but you know what I mean. The Indo-European people came out of this shared group and are such a drastically later distinct identity. Again, the swastika is around 17,000 years old, before and or during this migration into the Americas, from this sort of area that it developed out of. The conventional theory is just that the Native Americans independently made up this art, but that theory also came about before we realized how far back the migrations into America were. I think it makes far more sense that this was just around with these ancient groups. So everything from art symbols to fossils and DNA all line up not just with out of Africa, but even the timeline of migrations across the world. Now, why is the multi-regional hypothesis rejected? Let's start with its history. Earlier in the history of paleoanthropology, this model proposed that modern humans did not have a single origin in one place, but rather evolved in parallel in multiple regions from earlier humans, like Homo erectus and other. Remember, all hominids are humans. And since we know that they were spread all across the world much earlier, with erectus being all over the old world nearly 2 million years ago, in the multi-regional view, the populations of Africa, Europe, Asia, etc., all gradually transitioned into Homo sapiens together, with continuous gene flow between them preventing them from diverging into separate species. For example, they argued that Chinese Homo erectus evolved into modern Asian people, while Neanderthal evolved with some mixing into modern Europeans, and all of this would happen over a very long time frame. This would mean that modern Europeans and Asians evolved distinctly on their continents, having extremely ancient local roots, possibly millions of years, and it doesn't require this African migration. There's even a modified angle that it doesn't have to be just Homo erectus. Why can't it just be that hominids evolved all over the Earth, and all regions of Earth saw those hominids become hominins, eventually evolving into something that is very similar across the whole world, but has obvious distinctions? I'll start with the weakest point against this. Scholars argue that we should expect to see regional continuity in fossils, meaning that traits of Asian Homo erectus should carry on into Chinese Homo sapien skulls. But instead, the earliest modern human fossils found in Asia and Europe generally lack the pronounced features of local archaic humans, and instead resemble recent African fossils in the most important ways. In China, for instance, modern human remains from about 40,000 years ago don't look like a simple progression from the much older Peking man who was of Homo erectus. The unique traits of those archaic populations faded, suggesting they were largely replaced by incoming modern humans. Stringer and colleague Peter Andrews argued in a seminal paper that features of today's regional populations are mostly recent, under 50,000 years, rather than reflections of some million-year lineage. Genetics delivered the most crushing blow to multiregionalism. If humans had evolved regionally for 2 million years coming out of Homo erectus, populations from different continents would be far more genetically divergent than they are. Instead, we find remarkable genetic unity. The Mitochondrial Eve and Y-Adam studies show that even if that is a tiny percentage, it is still an undeniable link, with our species developing over the last few 100,000 years, not from multiple ancient lineages in different lands. And it cannot be stressed enough that these alternative theories all came about before we had DNA sequencing. The multi-regional model also has trouble explaining the clear pattern of higher African diversity and lower diversity everywhere else. You could try and tweak multi-regionalism to fit. Some have suggested maybe extensive gene flow essentially made it like one giant population, but still you're ending up at some point everyone coming out of Africa, and then maybe some other gene flow played a bigger role than our science currently says, but still that's out of Africa. And like mentioned in the last video on the destroying of the Eve concept, just about every scientist agrees with a modified out of Africa theory, but it's all for the same reason. What scientists believe and what they don't all hinges on the DNA evidence. It's undeniable that other hominin groups played a role in our evolution, but like mentioned, that's only affecting that 0.01% of what makes us different. This is sometimes called the leaky replacement model. We replaced other humans mostly, but some leakage of their genes comes into ours. So it's not that other regions played no role in our evolution, but it's just such a small part. You can't say that modern Asians are descendant from some previous hominid like Asian Homo erectus, but to the very limited extent that it has an effect, people of Asia were more affected by the other hominins of Asia. One really crucial piece of evidence in chronology came when modern human fossils were found in modern Israel and were dated older than some Neanderthal fossils in this same region, which makes no sense if Neanderthals were the direct ancestors of those modern humans. It agreed with all the other evidence that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals coexisted. And again, this is all starting to build up in the 1980s, and the better we get at genomic sequencing, and the sheer volume of more data we have in genetic sequencing, it's all overwhelmingly supporting the recent African origin model. Even anthropologist Milford Wolpoff, a champion of multi-regionalism, once said that reports of the death of his theory were exaggerated, but even he acknowledges the massive African role. Essentially, the debate has shifted. Nobody's really arguing against the African origin anymore. It's all in the specifics, finer questions about where exactly, when, and how much, if any, archaic contributions from outside Africa occurred. You could argue that before they didn't think there was any Neanderthal influence. Now it's up to maybe 3% in some people. Couldn't that just keep going up? And that just doesn't understand how it works. We're never going to get to something like 50-50. That would have already been very clear in the DNA sequencing. And I do want to add, especially since these sorts of videos attract countless type of comments who are in revulsion of the idea of sharing ancestry with Africans, which is funny because it really does prove that it's a racial thing. You should be mad that scientists are claiming you share ancestry with something even more primitive than a chimp, and even more primitive than a plant. But I wanted to point out how internally illogical their point is. Despite how this could be weaponized by some ill-intentioned people, they're doing it anyway and just making up things. So I found this line of reasoning fascinating, and to steelman their point, it actually is the best argument for genetic-based racism, because since all scientists agree that only tiny changes to DNA matter, These tiny changes in Eurasians could explain the greater complexity and technological innovations that we see emerging from these areas. If it's hominids evolving into hominins, and then Homo sapiens specifically, people argue that those who moved out of Africa evolved even further. But we can examine this too with the DNA. Academics say the San people are the oldest shared ancestors in Africa, and this chart shows how genetically different other modern groups are from the San people. In other words, how much other people diverged from them or evolved beyond that group. Ethiopians are the closest at about 0.8%, which is what you'd expect being so nearby and still in Africa. Yorubans are about the same. Iranians and Germans, so you could say that whole Indo-European line, is at most 12% different, which you can see maybe is in favor of that racial theory. But just keep going and you can see how quickly this becomes inconvenient for a sort of white and the sense of what they really mean by it just being a few countries in Northwest Europe. Because Indians from India and Han Chinese get to 13%, but worse for their internal logic is that the indigenous Australians get to 14%, and the people of the Amazon in South America are at 15%. So let's just be blunt here. A racial theory could just look at those first four, and since they're basically saying that these differences account for intelligence, you could say, look, the numbers are clear. The dumbest German and Brit are smarter than the smartest Africans. But even there, the percentiles are the same, so they would have to invite all of the Middle East into the club. And the Indians and Asians can say that their dumbest is equal to the average white, and the smartest on Earth would have to be in the Amazon, with their dumbest being smarter than everyone. And they are the most distant from Africans, the most evolved of all Homo sapiens on Earth. I hope it's clear, I'm not arguing for this, I'm just laying out that according to these people's own internal logic, it fails. Because they're pinning this superior race idea on the idea of the creation of civilizations, high technology, and culture, arguing that it's directly tied to genetics, and arguing that it matters how genetically distant groups are from early African populations. But again, the DNA evidence is clear here. And if being genetically distant from Africans was what truly mattered, we'd expect Native Americans to have developed the most advanced tech, monumental architecture, and complex civilizations before anyone else, since they are the furthest genetically from early human groups. Yet historically, the earliest civilizations, monumental structures, and innovations these people are proud of appear in places like Egypt, the Middle East, India, China, and Europe. Regions genetically much closer to African populations than the people of Australia or the Americas. It's clear genetic distance from Africa isn't what fueled human progress or technological advancements. It's just a useless theory. It's the worst critique you can have of an argument. Its internal logic is flawed. Human progress and civilization have always been shaped by a complex interplay of culture, trade, and other historical circumstances and honestly randomness, not by these ridiculously small genetic differences. I get a kick of just how efficient the DNA evidence is. This one chart shows why it's both so dumb to focus on these tiny genetic differences, while simultaneously mapping on perfectly to what the out-of-Africa model would predict. The further you go from Africa, the more genetically unique you become. Clearly, the debate should be around the effects of culture. It's clear some cultures are better than others. The best argument against the types that get upset when you say one culture is better than the other, thinking that they're sticking to some vague sense of cultural relativism that you shouldn't judge people, the most basic intro philosophy example is just Germany over the past 100 years. The story of just one people, the Germans, they used to have one culture, they took on another during the Third Reich, and after that changed their culture again. I'm sure all three time periods had different things you could critique, but one of these cultures was obviously worse. One culture was inferior. And so it's not a racial point, it's the same people group, and you could do the same by examining the history of all sorts of people, from the wild changes of the British to Persian or Chinese cultures. Some cultures lead to productivity in different areas, and some things stagnate or set back technological and philosophical advancement. And to really stress both how useless the genetic obsession is and how important culture is, some of the most obvious recent examples are in American history, where slaves with sub-Saharan ancestry, some like Phyllis Wheatley were not even descendants of slaves, but she was herself a first-generation slave, born in 1753 in West Africa, likely near modern-day Senegal or Gambia. But even if the culture at large was against her and her people, at least her local culture, the culture in her house, was extremely conducive to intellectual flourishing. She was treated uniquely well by her owners, studying literature, history, classical languages like Latin and Greek, and the Bible. And upon publishing her book Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral in 1773, Wheatley quickly became famous on both sides of the Atlantic. And by only the age of 20, she was widely celebrated as a great writer. Wheatley famously wrote a poem praising Washington, titled To His Excellency George Washington, and he warmly responded, inviting her to meet him. And Washington was said to have been greatly impressed with her poetic ability. And they weren't being patronizing or saying that was great work for a slave. Most people didn't know she was African. By her name, they just assumed it was some European woman. Benjamin Franklin and other American intellectuals recognized and appreciated her talents, adding to her credibility and fame. And Selina Hastings, Countess of Huntingdon, was an influential English patroness who helped Wheatley get her book published in London, boosting her prominence even further. And as you might have guessed, when people did realize that she was black, the people who were able to rationalize black African slavery on the basis of their inferiority, this was an inconvenient fact and they just doubted that a slave actually wrote them. It just must have been someone else writing it for her in the white household. There was such hoopla around this that to silence these doubts, a prominent group of Boston intellectuals and community leaders, including John Hancock, later president of the Continental Congress and signer of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Hutchinson, who at the time was governor of Massachusetts, Reverend Charles Chauncey, and other prominent clergymen and scholars, all assembled to interrogate Wheatley directly. The examination took place in October 1772, and they rigorously questioned her on classical literature, theology, history, and her own creative writing process. Ultimately, the group was thoroughly convinced by Wheatley's responses. They concluded publicly that she was indeed the legitimate author of her works. To certify this fact, they signed a written attestation, which was included as a preface to her most famous work, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Morals, which then came out in 1773. Because they all wanted to explicitly make the point that they believed in her authorship and talent. This unprecedented endorsement became crucial evidence against racist claims that African people were just intellectually inferior. It's almost like we're all the same species, and genius is one of the deepest mysteries of our species. And while the Victorian-era categorization was clumsy, it wasn't absurd to point out that a rich culture of literature did not exist in West Africa. But there are countless examples throughout history that exposure from one group to whatever you find to be the most interesting civilization, be it periods in China or Rome or the United States, people from different racial groups can be brought in and they can thrive in these new cultures, sometimes more so than the people who were born into that culture. Genius is rare within whatever racial group happens to be at the cutting edge of advances in that tech, be it your average Egyptian, Sumerian, Indian, Chinese, European. Whoever you think had the best and most advanced culture, a majority of them all would have had, by definition, average intelligence. The geniuses that were actually responsible for those advancements were far less than 99.9% of the population. And so let's focus on what aspects of cultures help all of humanity flourish, instead of that less than 0.01% that separates us.